Surfcast Podcast, we are back again. Toby, very excited. Today we have an episode that was spun off of something that we talked about in Surf Association. And it was a question I asked you. And it was, when do you use a floating needlefish? At least I think that's what it is, because I've already kind of forgotten. That's probably close to what it was. Probably not exactly. Yeah. Close enough.
Which is something that took me by surprise. It was a tough one to really answer initially.
Yeah, that's right. And as part of that, and what you just said, we started talking about, well, what would happen if you had to fish on the surface? What lures would you use? And we started to talk about it, and I said, stop. Let's save this for the podcast. And so the question became, and the topic for today's podcast is going to be, if you had to pick 3 lures, plugs that were going to be on the surface, so they have to be on the surface, what would you choose and why? And I actually think your immediate reaction and what you told me was probably the most interesting part and probably what we'll mostly focus on. And it wasn't exactly what I expected. So I'm going to let you go and say that now and let us hear it.
Yeah, hopefully I get the same general answer because I've thought about it a little bit more since now. We are talking nighttime, so...
We are talking nighttime, that's right. Daytime's a whole nother thing. We're on the surface a lot or most of the time, but we're talking about nighttime.
Yes. Yeah, nighttime. So, I mean, initially my thought is I guess kind of like the needlefish. I don't really do it a whole lot. Like, I'm not planning to fish on the surface, is my initial gut reaction. But then as I kind of think it through, I have certain spots where it's part of my plug rotation.
Okay.
So it's I do and I don't.
So that's a little different than what you told me right away. Because last time when we were talking, you were like, I don't even know if I have anything. I don't even do that.
Well, that's right, because then I thought about it a bit more and I realized one spot for sure I add the surface coverage into rotation, and there's another one I don't add it in all the time. I add it in when I remember that on occasion I've done well there on the surface. Cool. But it's like a place that 95% of the time I don't bring a surface concentrating plug, but when I do, I've caught fish, which means I should probably bring it more, but I don't because I forget about it because it's not always in my rotation.
Interesting, but so that's really interesting that it's making you think about your spots more, because it does the same thing for me. And this specific topic made me think a bit more about my spots. It sounds like it did for you as well.
Yeah, it's, in like, the reason I say I don't really do it a lot now, or in my gut is that I don't, is because like in my evolution of fishing plugs in the surf, one of the things I tried to fish a lot and learn was the surface Danny. And I didn't do much on it. I didn't catch a whole lot because I just threw it like all the time in a lot of places. And I was just throwing it because I was trying to learn it, or I thought it should work. And I didn't throw it because it was probably the best to be throwing a surface lure at that spot. But now the place where I'm saying that it's a primary, it's not too much different than a whole lot of other places. But I just like to fish on top there, and I've done well on it. Now it's definitely shallow, which is going to weigh into me fishing the surface. I mean, at times I'm fishing over water that's like less than 2 feet deep, which I don't fish a whole lot in the surf. It's usually generally deeper than that. But it's just done well working on the surface. But I've also done well on divers. Even stuff that'll just dive down a foot has done really well in certain situations at this surface lure spot. So, you want me to say what lures it would be yet?
I do. I got to jump in, though. I got to say one thing. I don't want to get spun off too much on these sidebars because I feel like another episode just popped out from this. But I think it's really interesting for people to hear that, you're not fishing on the surface very much or very little. I'm the same way. But I will say that in places that I fish topwater, I'm not worrying about depth. Now, that being said, I'm not fishing ledge. I'm not in Maine. I'm not fishing the canal. I'm not fishing where water's really deep. But I'm not thinking about depth when I'm fishing on the surface. In fact, when I started thinking through the places where I'm on the surface, it's actually pretty deep. Now, spoiler alert, they're mostly where there's a lot of boulders. So that really changes how the fish interact with the bottom, and where they're in the column, it's much harder for them to be down in the column because then they're wasting a lot of energy going around and over rocks. I think they tend to come up a little bit. That's not always true. We've seen them pinned to the bottom, snaking their way through boulders as well. But I think it's interesting that you said that, because actually the places I use most of my top water at night, they're actually generally on the deeper side of what I normally fish, which is interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, as you say, I was trying to think through, like, do I have any deeper water spots that are bouldery? Okay, I've got some of those. Have I ever thrown top water there? Yeah, I have. Have I ever done anything? No.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. That's really, it's an interesting juxtaposition, as they say, between, what we're thinking and why we're throwing the top water, because I'm throwing these top water lures that I'm thinking about because of the profile and presentation they throw. And I think on the surface, they give off the vibe of a much bigger food item. And where the bigger food items tend to be for me is in some of these deeper places with boulders. So interesting. And that's certainly not the only place I throw surface either, but just something interesting to think about. But that's another conversation made for another time, because we could spend a whole year of podcasts on that. And people are going to get mad if we do not give them our lures now that we've teased them. So I'm going to let you go.
So I'll list off my 3.
Okay.
And kind of, if you want to, we can either discuss them or you throw yours and then discuss them. But my 3, so I'm thinking this through of specifically the one spot, the primary surface lure location. I'm packing a standard, like 7-inch surface Danny, essentially. It's the Musso torpedo style clone of that. So it's a surface swimmer, essentially a Danny, a slightly different shape. But it's a 7-inch model. It also might be, the secondary would be a jointed version of that exact same plug.
Okay, is that cheating?
But there's a no, because there's a reason. Because when one goes, generally if it's either what is it? If the jointed goes, they both go. But if the jointed's not, then it's the solid, and I'll explain the reasoning there.
Okay.
And then the third is the giant jointed eel.
Okay.
Then that's also another copy of one of Musso's creations that Jay, my fishing partner, made some copies of a few years ago. And that thing is massive. It's like, I think the wood alone is over 13 inches. It's like, putting off 14, 15, 16-inch surface jointed profile once you add the metal lip and the tail and everything onto it. So those 3 are my surface choices.
Very, very interesting. So tell me why, if you're using the jointed both go, but that's not true the other way around. I gotta know why.
So it was something when Jay and I were fishing through this location, we were learning it. We were throwing surface stuff a lot because, partly I guess because the first time we fished it, we did really well on the surface, so you continue to, stick to what has worked. But I noticed I was packing the jointed and the solid body like all the time, and then I think it was Jay had mentioned, either I questioned it or he just mentioned that. He was noticing when there was the chop on the surface, when we had some wind-blown chop, not waves rolling in, but like, kind of chumpy, chopped up, blocky, splashy surface, that he was doing better on the jointed version. And what we kind of thought or determined, figured out, hypothesized, however you want to put it, was that it was throwing more commotion, easier to pick up amongst the broken surface. Whereas when it's dead flat calm, it was throwing too much, and the non-jointed version, just sort of snaking along and wiggling on the surface, was sufficient to get noticed, look like food, natural, something the fish would eat. And that could almost get lost on the days that surface chop was there. So when it's like super flat calm, it's just the non-jointed version, because it's like it's too loud, it's too much commotion going with that jointed. But on the nights when there is the commotion, I'm throwing both, because there's parts of this location where there's more activity on the surface, like the way the water and the tide and everything's set up. So I'll fish the jointed version where it's kind of gnarliest on top and most broken up, but I won't fish it away from it as much. So it's like depending where I'm focusing with my casts, that's why I'll choose one or the other, and I'll switch between them. I'm fishing above it, above the commotion. All right, I'm fishing the non-jointed. When I want to then cycle through and try where it's kicked up, I'll switch and kind of cycle through it that way.
That's really interesting because I think, and I could be wrong, and people can send in comments if they want, but my assumption is in striper world, the jointed of anything is seen more as the plug to fish when it's not as choppy, when it's super calm, when you're looking for more action, and that a lot of, I think, at least this is my assumption, and what I've heard other people say is that that's the plug that you use when there's no wind and no chop or anything for the more seductive swim and being able to cast it and be able to swim it, etc. Mm-hmm. That's across the board for all plugs. But I think that's really interesting that for you, it's the opposite. Is that a plug specific thing though? Is that just that plug, or can you think of other examples?
Throw a lot. I don't really throw a lot of like other jointeds too often. I have, again, it's like based off of the giant one that I could talk in a sec. Jay made some diving ones, and just because if you didn't joint up a 14-inch plug and it was maple, as it is, the things are like 8 ounces. We'd be like looking at a 12-ounce monstrosity. So it just sort of works out that that those end up being jointed. I don't fish a lot of other jointeds, but again, it's something like you've talked about, wanting to have your thing blend in. I want it blending in and like disappearing on the calmer nights versus standing out. And when you're on a dark night glass calm surface, the last thing I think looks natural, even though it catches my eye more, is something making a lot of commotion. I don't try to do that so much on the surface.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So I shy away from that jointed, more active presentation when it's calmer like that. We've got something really cool to share with you today. Hoagie Lures, a company that's been a favorite among Northeast anglers for years, is doing something completely new and unique. They're letting you, the listeners of the Surfcast podcast, help design their next surf fishing plug through the Franken Popper project.
Yeah, so how it works is going to be really simple. They've set up a survey to find out how you actually use the popper in the surf. Hoagie wants to understand the structure you fish, your go-to rod and reel, your time of year of actually using poppers, and key design attributes of things you actually prefer, like body size, shape, weight, and even color.
All right, so here's the deal. When you participate, you'll automatically be added to Hoagie's best-kept secret, the Field Test Offer List, which grants you early access to test unreleased products. And as a thank you for helping build this legendary surf popper, participants will get a special $10 gift code good towards their next order on Hoagie's website, hoagielures.com.
So to participate, you can head over to that Hoagie site, or you can visit ours, surfcastpodcast.com/hoagielures, or simply just check out the show notes because it's down there too. Just don't wait. Hoagie's only collecting responses for a very short time. And one more thing to know, Toby, that I know you'll like. This popper will be designed to be fished with just a single hook.
As we've talked about on past episodes of the podcast, the plastic swimmer is one of the most popular plugs that's found in just about every surfcaster's bag, and there are a ton of models to choose from. With its unique body shape and lip design producing a great darting and swimming action, the standout is the Swarter by Joe Bags Tackle.
That's right, Toby. This plug is fully through wired, and it's available in 2 sizes, the 6-inch 1-ounce model and the 7-inch 1.5-ounce model. Comes in a wide variety of traditional and modern fish-catching colors like bone, blurple, sand eel, and many more. The Swarter excels in a huge variety of surf fishing conditions, from back bays to inlets, and of course, the wide open surf. It's been proven to be a great plug on both the East and West Coast for a variety of species, but particularly the striped bass.
So head on over to joebagsoutdoors.com and grab some Swarters while you support a locally owned business. And while you're there, be sure to check out the annual limited edition colorway, as well as Joe's Swarter kits, specifically tailored to meet a variety of surf fishing scenarios.
So it's interesting that your third one was the big eel, because I actually had that on my list too, with a giant disclaimer. And that's that, for me, it's actually a whole series of plugs that sort of all do the same thing. They're all in that category, but they don't all look the same. So the round nose with the lip on it, jointed in the middle, eel. I don't know if you want to call that an eely or if you want to, whatever you want to call it. I'm not the greatest at plug history. The difference is this is one of my weaknesses in the surf for sure. But it's interesting that that's on your list too, because I feel that of all of my plugs, that might be one of the most niche things I have. And I don't think that they get used very much. But yet, when we had to pick top 3 on the surface, it both made our list. And I think for me, again, when I'm thinking surface, and this could be incorrect, and I'm going to get to actually completely refuting what I'm going to say, but I'm often going for something really big when I'm on the surface. And these generally are big or throw off the illusion of something really big. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, going with that giant one, it's not, there's only a couple places I fish that plug. And this primary that I fish the surface. I mean, when I know there's, second to third level of chop is going to be out there, not wind, because it is about as anti-aerodynamic as possible. So it doesn't cast well into the wind. You need it's like that point, that perfect of somehow there's just enough wind to make a lot of chop, but it's not so much. It's screwing your casts up. But that lure throws off such a massive profile on the surface. But the way that it swims, it's on the surface, but it actually doesn't throw. I don't see from my perspective, granted it's probably different from the fish, it's not throwing as much of a big open commotion, because I have fished that I will throw that on those calmer nights as well. I've done the absolute best on it when there's more chop and it's really standing out. So it might to a level also be spooking stuff, spooking the fish away, especially in that really shallow water.
Yeah.
But that is one that, I mean, I fish that there. I throw it like you're saying, it's a niche plug. It falls in really select locations. Also the fact that it's taking so much damn space in the plug bag.
So much space.
My 3-tube has a front pouch and it fills the whole front pouch.
Yeah.
Where you throw something else in there and it's already sticking out. And
That's right.
I've made a single plug holder for it at one point, but it just became more of a pain in the butt to deal with that than sticking it where it was, in the pouch. But
that is one of the downsides. That the plug that I really think about though for this, and again I'm cheating because it's really something completely different, but in my head it's in the same category, is the old, I believe the company was Green Point. Do you remember them?
Mm-hmm.
Green Point.
The hand carved lures. He started out as hand carved and then became Green Point.
Yes, the Green Point. Yep. He made this eel type thing that had a plastic tail on it. And not that he was the first one to do this, but it was one of the early ones and was the first one I ever had. And that plug caught me a lot of fish. Actually, on sand beaches, caught me a lot of fish. And that sucker goes right on the surface and floats. So, again, it's a little bit different, but to me, they're all sort of the same category, just different size. Because, I got some that I know they're different, but some have the slope and some are the round nose. And to me, they all kind of do the same thing as they're right on the surface. Although some of them with the sloped nose don't stay on the surface at all. They really dig down. But
well, even that with the original jointed giant pikeys with they have the sloped nose, those when they're swimming, the way they're weighted too, the front half dove and the tail stayed on top, so it was like fighting itself on the top. That's too. Right. So it's combining trying to dive with a surface.
That's right. And it also interesting, my first choice is very similar to your, and I didn't even ask you if yours was like hierarchy of like, I would choose this, and then I would choose this, and I would choose this. But I'm assuming that your first choice was sort of your first choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my first choice is very similar as well. I would choose a Danny or a Pikey. I'm cheating again, because those are two different things. But to me, they do the same thing, and honestly, half the time it comes down to what fits in the bag, because the Gibbs Danny is a little bit smaller, and I can maybe, if I can get an extra plug in there around it versus like a Mike's Custom Pikey, which is even bigger around, or like a Tank Pikey, which is even bigger than that. But to me, they do the same thing. The Pikey casts just a smidge better, probably, but some don't. Like some of Don's after hours Pikeys don't cast as well as a Gibbs Danny does. So it really depends kind of on the plug. But those are for me the same category. And I fish those, honestly, there's a time and a place for them for when it's like, this is the plug. But sometimes I put them on because I just enjoy fishing those. I admit it. I really do enjoy fishing a Danny. One of my biggest fish, my first really big fish that was 48 inches. That's what I caught it on. And it was a little bit of a surprise because I'd been fishing a whole bunch of other stuff and I pulled that out and it was like 3 casts in. So there's a place for it in my heart. And so sometimes I fish them just for that reason. But I do think that those two plugs together can be serious boulder field bangers. They can really work well in boulder fields where there's some bigger baits. Late in the summer, into early fall, that seems to be a time where I reach for those.
Now, sure. Which Gibbs Danny? Is it the 6 or the 7?
I only go for the 7. I know most guys like the 2.5 ounce, which is the middle one. I almost only exclusively use the big one because of everything I've just said, because of how I use it and what I'm thinking when I reach for it. But on the flip side of that, if I can fish this, I will try to fish it almost all the time. The problem is I can never fish this next plug because I can't reach where the fish are, or, excuse me, I end up using a soft plastic. This is what happens. So do you know what I'm going to say, Toby? Can you guess what I'm going to say?
No. I know as soon as you say it, I'm like, oh, yeah, of course. But right now, no.
An unloaded redfin. An unloaded redfin, right? So that's, if I can fish an unloaded redfin, I'm going to try, because for some reason, for me, where I fish the way I fish, an unloaded redfin is like the default catcher. If there's something there, I'm going to catch it. So it's not the first thing out of my bag a lot of times, because oftentimes the thing that's there that I'm going to end up catching is going to be a sub fish of some kind. It's not the 35 pounder. It's something under 20. But the problem is, like I said, they cast so terrible, just so unbelievably terrible. And then if you get them into any kind of situation with like a surf or something, they don't really fish so great either. And I'm often going to be reaching for a soft plastic. If I can fish that redfin unloaded, I probably can fish a sluggo with a swim bait hook, and then that's probably what I'm going to actually reach for in that situation. So
but you wouldn't be fishing the soft plastic on the surface. But
the soft plastic doesn't fish on the surface because technically it sinks and that goes down. So right, exactly. You've got it exactly. To that point, though, I'm gonna because I know we're getting towards the end of the episode here. I'm going to give you 2 cheaters that are both cheating, but I was thinking about this, and I think one of them might be interesting to you. And it's not this one. I'm going to start with the one that I find interesting. The Freestyler, Savage Gear Freestyler, my love, and the new one's even better with this. You can keep that on the surface. It can be on the surface, and in fact, I've had great bites where I think I've been popping it out of the water. I can't see it because it's too far out in the dark, but I think I'm jumping that thing out of the water just like bunker. Just like a bunker does, how they flip and stuff. And I've had really, really good luck keeping that sucker on the surface by working it really fast. The old Freestylers, if you rig them the right way, they float anyways. So I'm not sure about the new one, but they sink even slower. Gosh, this is something I probably should do some research on, but they sink even slower. So I'm assuming if you rig those the right way, you'd have a surface plug as well. They don't technically count, though, in my mind, because if they're rigged correctly, they sink. And I'm fishing them subsurface, and I'm not on the surface, so they don't count. But the other thing is, there are quite a few soft plastics these days that are fished either when you fish them, they're right on the surface, and maybe they sink so like Gravity stuff or Joe bags. They're sink, or even Hoagie too. They sink so slowly that with any amount of fishing action, if you're not using a jig head, they're on the surface. Technically, they sink. Technically, even with just a small hook, they sink, right? But I think that those big soft plastics, for me, are another thing that I fish on the surface a lot of times when I'm swinging in a current or something like that, that they're up higher. A lot being in the frame of reference that we're talking about, you and I fish these things with jig heads a lot. So then it's obviously we're getting down, we're on purpose, right? But I think that that's another option for something big to put on the surface. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's 2 things. It's funny, you went to the redfin. I was back and forth. That was like on and off my list as I was like putting it together in my head. It ended up, as we saw, off of my list. But because I guess of frequency of being used these days, even though I'm working to bring the redfin back into rotation more often, that's like looking down the road. So I'm going off of, this recent season and
Right.
the last couple of years. If you went
Sure.
back 10 years ago probably 10, 12 years ago, the redfin would have been on these three, on my top three of the unloaded. But as you were telling your your extra cheaters, it made me think of something that I almost always consider when I'm fishing on the surface is I slow everything down even more. Probably the slowest retrieves of all of my surf casting, aside from maybe an eel, is surface. I want it like the slowest I can get it to move so that it's still doing something. What do you have a brief general speed thought with the surface
If
lures?
it's got a lip, I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
But when I'm fishing those glide baits, and the freestyler isn't the only one, there's some other, there's Sabio made a floater. Weston has some what they call low floats, where they like float but not really. They're like not super buoyant. They're right under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these things I really bang across the surface. I mean, I'm really working this thing hard and fast across. I'm trying to give it a lot of action. And to do that, I got to go a little faster because I got to keep up with the slack. So if you're really working this thing hard and you're really giving it a lot of tip action and stuff to catch up with it, you got to kind of go a little faster. And sometimes I'm going pretty damn fast on nights where it's just glass calm and there's nothing happening, blah, blah, blah. That has nothing to do with it. So I'm not talking about it in a big surf trying to draw attention. It really is more about the behavior of the bait I'm trying to mimic. And it's just another kind of presentation. So if it's got a lip, sure. But sometimes I'm really working that sucker fast across the surface. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.